Is the US abandoning Europe just as the continent becomes increasingly worried about threats coming from Russia? Reports suggest that Washington is planning to cut its military hardware that it dedicates to NATO in a crisis situation. Now, according to sources, US representatives told NATO partners at a meeting in Brussels last week that they were planning to scale down the number of strategic bombers, fighter jets, drones, submarines and warships it makes available. It comes as the alliance is under unprecedented strain, with Donald Trump repeatedly criticising it and openly threatening to pull the US out of NATO altogether. Now, in a moment, I'll be speaking to Dr. Eileen Matley, a senior research fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations. But first, let's take a look at those planned US cuts to military support for NATO. Now, according to reports, the United States is set to halve the number of strategic bombers, cut the number of fighter jets by 1/3, and reduce warships available to the alliance. Also, no submarines will be provided for use, and the US would cut armed drone support. Europe's NATO members will have to use their own reconnaissance drones. One thing, though, that would not change, and that is the US is expected to continue backing NATO with its nuclear deterrence capabilities. Well, Dr. Eileen Matley is Senior Research Fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and it's great to see you. Thank you very much for being with us. I'd just like to start by asking what we really know about these US reductions to NATO during a crisis. I mean, what exactly does during a crisis even mean?
Hello, and thanks for having me. So there's actually a couple of questions that you've raised, and the answers to that, in my opinion, are uncertain and unclear as of now. While we do have those reportings having come out in very recent days, but also over the course of the last couple of weeks, it is not clear yet what exactly those troop reductions will mean in terms of how many troops exactly will be redeployed or withdrawn from Europe altogether, which capabilities exactly will be withdrawn, and then almost even more importantly, on what timeline. And it's my understanding that even the Pentagon is not clear on that yet, and that makes it obviously a bit more difficult, especially for NATO allies, to respond and to come up with answers on how to deal with those possible repercussions of a drawback or maybe even a complete withdrawal, which I find very unlikely to happen. But then to the second part of your question, what does a crisis actually refer to? That again is also a bit difficult to answer, and I would say for good reasons, because now that we are at least officially speaking or legally speaking in a peace, still in peace times, there are authorities granted to NATO SACEUR to move around troops in order to exercise, for example, and also to signal some readiness vis-a-vis Russia. And then if NATO were actually to move into a sort of crisis mode, preparing for a possible military confrontation with Russia, it is also not exactly clear, at least not to the public, and again, I think for good reason, in which steps exactly NATO would take, and then it's also not clear and not public knowledge in which steps the US would take in order to support NATO. I mean, for the time being, NATO is still, the US still has capabilities and troops earmarked in the NATO force model, which is essentially the major sort of the major model and the major organization hub for NATO to prepare for a crisis and also to be able to respond to a crisis.
So what you're saying then is it's even NATO itself is probably not going to give us much more information on what a crisis would be, because that would be kind of delivering some of their information to the so-called enemy. You mentioned there that the US has made no secrets of plans to draw down troops in Europe. And we did have a US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who was speaking just last week on this very topic. Let's just have a listen to what he had to say.
I think it's well understood in the alliance that the United States troop presence in Europe is going to be adjusted. That work was already ongoing, and it's been done in coordination with our allies. I'm not saying they're going to be thrilled about it, but they certainly are aware of it. You know, we have obligations in the Indo-Pacific, we have obligations in the Middle East, we have obligations in the Western Hemisphere. So this has been an ongoing process. Shouldn't be a surprise to anybody.
Well, that, of course, was on troops. We're talking specifically now about military hardware. Should we be surprised that now we've moved from troops to the possibility of cutting military hardware?
No, we shouldn't be surprised about that, because obviously you need hardware, you need weapon systems in order to defend yourself. And for that, and for those to be operated, you need troops. So long story short, you need both. So if the US was planning to reduce its presence, its sort of military footprint in Europe, it should have been clear that that would also translate into not only troop reductions, but also the equipment that those troops are supposed to operate.
I mean, there has been some confusion just while we're talking about US troops and about withdrawals over announcements. Most noticeably, we had Donald Trump talking about Germany, saying he would pull out 5,000 troops, then saying that the US would deploy an additional 5,000 troops to Poland. It is confusing for NATO allies, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think that is almost the biggest problem, not the fact that the US wants to withdraw. I think it is also understandable in a sense, and I think most European allies also understand that they have to contribute more to NATO's burden sharing equation. And I think that in it of itself should definitely not have come as a surprise. However, what makes this entire issue a bit more complicated is the confusion that you just alluded to, because it would be much easier for NATO European allies to respond if they knew exactly what the plans on part of the US are. But if within the US government there seems to be sometimes confusion or even contradictions in some ways, and in some senses, then it's even more difficult for European allies to know exactly what the US is planning to do beyond saying that they want to lessen their or sort of to reduce their footprint in Europe.
And you talked there about capabilities. I mean, would you say that this is punishment for Europe, not spending enough on their militaries, and of course that lack of support for the US over the Iran war?
I don't think that we should think about this entire question of the US's support and commitment to NATO Europe in terms of a punishment, especially not in the current context of the Iran war, because as we discussed earlier, the US has had those plans for quite some time, dating back even to a time when Donald Trump had not re-entered the White House. So I don't think that Europeans should think of that as a punishment of sorts. There might be an element to that in the current context of the Iran war, but strategically speaking, I don't think that the US has now come to the conclusion or sort of arrived at the conclusion to which translated into the recent announcements in order to send a punishment message to European allies. And in terms of not spending enough, I don't think that is something that the US can still claim in light of last year's decision at NATO's The Hague summit, where allies agreed to spend up to 5% of their GDP on defense in the next coming years, possibly the next decade. And beyond that decision and announcement of last year, you can see a clear trajectory of NATO European allies plus Canada already spending, much more on defense for the past couple of years, which is a development that was sort of kicked off already prior to last year's summit decision.
Yes, and even before these cuts came to light, Europe has obviously been making plans to ultimately rely less on the US, as you say yourself. Let's just listen to NATO chief Mark Rutte, who was speaking last week.
But let's be clear. The trajectory we are on, which is a stronger Europe and a stronger NATO, making sure we will, over time, step by step, be less reliant on one ally only, as we have been for so long, which is the United States.
Mark Rutte there explaining that NATO can't afford to only rely on the United States. But in reality, what will these US cuts to NATO really mean in practice, particularly for European allies?
Again, it depends very much on the exact systems that the US wants to withdraw, or in some cases withhold. For example, with regards to deep precision strike capabilities that the US had bilaterally agreed on to deploy to Germany back when Joe Biden was still US president. That decision was made in 2024, and the deployment was supposed to start this year in the next couple of weeks. And now, a couple of weeks ago, that decision was reversed by Donald Trump. And those capabilities are direly needed, not only in Germany, but for the defense and also for deterrence purposes of NATO Europe as a whole. And if those capabilities will indeed not be delivered by the US as planned, then then Europe really is facing a serious capability gap. And in the short term, it will be rather difficult for Europeans to close that gap. But then again, in the medium term, let's say in the next 3 to 5 years, it is possible for Europeans to close that gap. And in fact, a couple of European allies also in 2024, after the announcement of the bilateral agreement was made, a couple of Europeans also announced that they were working on sort of co-production plans to come up with their own European solution that the US was supposed to supplement until such time as Europeans would be able to fill that gap themselves.
Yeah, but of course, filling the gap costs money, and the big multi-billion-dollar question really is, how can NATO members really afford to defend themselves without the US?
I don't think that it is necessarily a fiscal problem, although I'm aware of the sort of fiscal constraints in many European allies, and Germany certainly is in an almost standalone position in that regard when it comes to freeing up resources to be spent on defense. However, looking at the sort of the wealth of European NATO allies, I don't think it is a matter of not being able to afford defending themselves. I think the question should be turned around by asking, can we afford not to spend that money? Because not spending that money and possibly ending up in a confrontation with Russia would be much, much more costly. And then again, there's also, there's also avenues that have not been taken yet, or at least not efficiently, in the sense of co-production, in the sense of really making use of the effect of economies of scale in order to lower prices of unit costs of certain systems. So I think there is still a lot of leeway for Europeans to take advantage of in order to fill some of the gaps that the US might be leaving behind.
And NATO members have been working hard on bilaterals. I mean, just this week we have the UK and Poland signing a new defence and security treaty with, of course, Russia in particular focused there. And at the same time, Germany's Defence Minister Boris Pistorius is meeting with his Canadian counterpart to also discuss defence. Do you think this is all enough, or is it too late?
I mean, the question is too late for what? I mean, so far, luckily, we have not seen any precise and preparations taking place on part of Russia to attack NATO territory. So I think NATO's deterrence works for the time being. However, obviously, we should not be complacent in any sense. Rather, to the contrary, there really should be a sort of an urgency present in political decision-making circles, which I think, at least for the better part of Europeans, is present. Whether that will be enough, the efforts that are on the way now, is a bit difficult to assess at this very time. I think it's always better or easier to answer such a question in hindsight. However, what I will say is that I think we can see, we are witnessing much more movement on part of Europeans to speed up their efforts to be more able to act. Also, and if necessary, independently of the US, or at least with lesser US support.
OK, but what about Europe's very worst scenario, that the US could decide to leave NATO altogether? Do you think that that's a realistic possibility?
It depends on how you define a US exit from NATO. Legally speaking, it is really difficult for the US president to withdraw his country from NATO. He would have to seek approval from the US Senate. And I don't think that any such approval would be forthcoming, at least not for the time being. Politically and also strategically speaking, there are steps that the US president can take, and to a certain extent has already taken in the past to undermine the sort of credibility of NATO by, for example, questioning whether the US would come to the help of any European allies in case of a crisis. I wouldn't equate that with the US exiting NATO, but it certainly does sort of raise questions and concerns within the alliance about the reliability of US commitment to NATO. However, I think we shouldn't underestimate the fact that the US also benefits from being in that alliance. For example, the war against Iran demonstrated how much the US also depends on bases and also airspace of European allies. And obviously that is very intimately connected to its membership in NATO. So I think Europeans should a bit more forcefully also present the argument to the US how much the US is in fact benefiting from being a member of NATO.
A very good point to end on. Dr. Eileen Matley, Senior Research Fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations, thank you very much for your insights.
You're welcome.
So do tell us what you think about NATO and the role the US plays and will play in the future by writing in the comments. Thank you very much for your company. I'm Alex Forrest-Whiting. Until next time.